should maybe just start with my own disclosures, which is, for those who don't know me very well, I'm a British South African developmental neuropsychiatrist, and I trained and worked in the UK for a long time and then came back to Africa about 10 years ago to set up a Center for Autism Research in Africa. And I work with many international colleagues in many different countries, working with non-profit organizations, with government organizations, etc. And so everything I do in listening to today's amazing symposium and the first day of the two is therefore through those international eyes. And so that's part of my disclosure. The second part of my disclosure, I have an adult brother who is autistic. And if you meet him, he would tell you that he's a 42-year-old spring chicken. And in fact, he was diagnosed by me in adulthood, and he never received autism intervention services in South Africa, and he went through the special education system here in the country. So those are the eyes through which I have listened to conversations today, and therefore my own biases and intellectual and other conflicts of interest, or positive interests, hopefully, in my comments. I set myself up the task to try and identify gaps and make comments and say things that nobody else had said today. And I started with a very long list of things that I was going to say. And as you were all talking, I crossed things off the list because I thought, yep, nope, I was going to say that. I was going to say that. Yep, that's a good point. So rather than to try and fill in any gaps, I'm just going to make a few summary comments and really just to highlight some of the really, really valuable things that people said today. And so just 5 comments. And the first of my comments is about global patterns of aging. Yes, the whole world is getting older, but it's not getting older at an equal rate everywhere. So in high-income countries, for example, countries are getting older much faster, but in many low and middle-income countries, that's not the case. So sometimes it has quite a flat or a much lower rate. And interestingly, countries where that have lower median rates of age have higher population growth. So if you look at countries like Ethiopia and Uganda and Nigeria, in fact, many African countries, we have rapid population growth, but actually quite a low mean age, which means life expectancy is still quite low in many parts of the world. So when we're thinking about aging in a global context, the picture therefore looks quite different. Global aging experts calculate something that they call an age dependency rate. So they take the under 15-year-olds and the over 65-year-olds and say, these are the people who are dependent on the working group. And they calculate ratios. So in the US, the age dependency ratio is about 60%. So 60% of the population are dependent on 40% for economic outputs and support. Whereas in many countries, particularly again in Africa, that age dependency rate is in some countries 80 to 90%. So 80 or 90% of the population are dependent on 10 or 20% for economic activity, etc. So you can see aging is a dynamic thing, and it's highly variable depending on where we are. Now, you might say we're a North American group primarily, but I think that this variable pattern around aging and ratios may also be the case in American and North American disadvantaged communities, and your health disparities that a few people have touched on very briefly in relation to aging and access to services for people with aging, I think will be a really important aspect to consider and to dive into more deeply in your context. And certainly if we're going to take this program around autism and aging more globally, we really need to think about those differential patterns in much more concerted ways. My second message is, and hopefully you'll all agree, is really about the power of the voice of people, and many of you have said that too. It just makes such a difference to start a meeting and to embed everything we say in the voices of people who live with autism. And if we keep doing that, I have no doubt we'll move in and keep on moving in the right direction. I was very struck by how many of you were diagnosed late. This will hopefully reduce over time, but I think the lag may still be there for quite some time, particularly again in low and middle income countries and in low resource communities, even in the US and Canada. It's also interesting that many people are still misdiagnosed. Bipolar, schizophrenia, what are all the things, Hyro, that you and others have talked about. And so that theme around the importance of training adult psychiatrists, adult psychologists, physicians, anybody who works with adults, to make sure that we help them identify people who are autistic and identify their co-occurring conditions accurately, I think remains an interesting task. And I'm interested to see how you will think about and talk about that tomorrow when the meeting continues. Great to hear progress and to see all of you being such proudly autistic self-advocates, talking about skills and talents and what other people can learn from autistic people. And my own story and family story really resonated. Hyro, when you and others talked about the importance of seeing an adult autistic person as an adult, not as a child. Even when your interests may be unusual, you are still an adult. And I think that's such a powerful message for us all to keep in mind and to make sure that we stick to that philosophy. My third point is about thinking how we can close the gap between bottom up and top down. I was very struck. You placed a self-advocate session, and then a little bit later we had your incredibly powerful and very interesting national organizations that include policy and funding and all sorts of things. And I also heard Teal and Stephen talk about participatory research and the voices of autistic people, but I couldn't help but wonder if there's a way in which one can bring together the lived experts with your powerful national organizations, including policy and so on, in an ongoing and meaningful way right from the beginning. The biggest impact on policy is when policymakers are participants right from the start, rather than at the end, as we heard, a 40-page document or something. So for example, much more overt participatory research, implementation science research, perhaps using methods such as theory of change. For those who are not familiar with theory of change, it's a method we might use in implementation science to say, let's start with what we want the end state to be. How do people with autism want to live? How do they want to age? What services do they need? How do they want them? And then work back from there. So maybe there's a real opportunity for Autism Speaks and for others to think, how can you perhaps facilitate structures and ongoing participatory initiatives, not just occasional and not just writing into an agency with information. So that was another thought. That was my third thought in terms of how can we close this gap between bottom up and top down over time. My fourth point, which may sound strange, is let's not forget the children. And there was a theme where we talked about how great it is to have an increased focus on adults, aging adults, older adults, but also the importance of not forgetting children and young people, also, again, particularly in low and middle income countries and in low resource communities. But the same theme came from Joe Piven's work, the exciting potential of science that we can get from aging and autism, but not to forget the fundamentals of early identification, early intervention at whatever age that may be. My fifth comment is about heterogeneity. We know about heterogeneity in autism. We also know about heterogeneity in services and systems for autistic people. So yes, we need to think about autism across the lifespan, but the heterogeneity of autistic people in themselves may mean that these pathways throughout and into adult life and older adult life might also be highly heterogeneous. I saw some of the graphs associated with aging. I can't remember whose they were, might have been Marshall Meilik's, and they are very diverse. And so the risk for us is not to want to draw single lines. And I think somebody talked about the non-linearity, but also not to oversimplify, because there may be many, many different, many unique pathways and journeys through and into older adult life for different autistic people. It's great to be reminded of the advances in geriatric medicine, the advances in the ability to put together a team. But I think it's important that we remember that that's not yet the case in low and middle income countries, and that's not yet the case in many low resource and disadvantaged communities either. So really a reminder not to make things too simplistic. My final comment, and I thought that was going to be a unique comment until Tamar spoke, is really about doing everything in the context of family. Quality of life, support, all those kinds of things. Yes, we need to think about individuals, but even in countries where we have no resources, where we don't have the amazing infrastructures that might exist in the US and elsewhere, we will have loving and supportive families. And so I think really thinking about the changing needs of families and the changing needs of aging family members as well is a really interesting and important theme and a dynamic thing to think about. So also thinking about how do we care for the aging family members. In my own family story, as you know, the role of mothers and fathers get less and less and less, and they pass away, and siblings become more prominent players. And so and sometimes, other younger family members. So it's really also about thinking, what is the dynamic change in the aging support system around autistic people? Very rarely will there be people outside the family who are more interested and more committed to ensuring a good quality of life for their family members. So with that, you've heard my 5 points, nothing particularly new, and really just to say thank you for an incredibly stimulating meeting. And I really look forward to hearing how this will unfold tomorrow and also in the years to come. Thank you.